Dealing with fallout from political, economic, and environmental disaster, can Sri Lanka continue its recovery? A 5-year financial crisis culminated in a political revolution. But in the midst of an upswing, economists warn debt restructuring is needed now to avoid another fall. So can repayments be suspended? And is more debt relief what the country really needs? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Sri Lanka. Less than a month ago, Sri Lanka was ravaged by what its president called the most challenging natural disaster in its history. And it came just a year after Sri Lanka's crushing $9 billion national debt was painfully restructured. Even before Cyclone Ditwah, many complained the burden on taxpayers was unsustainable. But now, top economists are warning if repayments are not put on hold, the economy could collapse again. So even with a remarkable growth rate of more than 5% and further growth expected, is Sri Lanka still in danger? Here's a look.
Sri Lanka is a country buffeted by headwinds and catastrophes, both literal and financial. Cyclone Ditwah flattened homes, levelled infrastructure, and brought deadly deluges when it struck in November.
My wife, son-in-law, daughter, mother-in-law, 2 grandsons are all dead. I don't have any protection here. They were all that I had. We have lost our land, house, everything.
It was the deadliest natural disaster to hit Sri Lanka since the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. The storm left over 600 people dead, nearly 200 more missing. Amid the damage, a country in financial dire straits remains.
Well, Sri Lanka has always been identified as one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, but we have never seen anything like this. We have never seen 25 districts all affected at the same time, and the level of the devastation we are seeing across the country, we have never seen anything like this before. When families and communities lose assets very quickly, as was the case with the economic crisis and with this natural disaster, it's very difficult for them to come out of the cycle of vulnerability and poverty.
Sri Lanka's recovery efforts were boosted by an emergency $200 million IMF aid and disaster relief fund. But the country had already been declared bankrupt in 2022 when it defaulted on its debt obligations. That ushered in a $3 billion bailout back then, when the country had been facing economic challenges on multiple fronts, which exacerbated food, electricity and fuel shortages and political instability. The country's weak and shaky economic situation was, however, showing signs of a turnaround, a slow incremental recovery when the cyclone hit.
Our task is to do the right thing at this moment, bring more and more investment, so maintain this economic trajectory. So as I just highlighted, the 5% growth, and will gradually increase by aiming medium-term growth more than 7%. So this is the target line.
But Sri Lanka sits in the top 10 list of countries which are most at risk of extreme weather events in the Global Climate Risk Index. Ditwah obliterated the progress Sri Lanka was making economically on the original 2022 IMF bankruptcy bailout. Before the storm, Sri Lankan annual repayments were sitting at around 25% of all government revenues, which many economists said was harsh on Sri Lankan taxpayers. Economists have called for debt restructuring and a grace period to pause repayments to allow for relief efforts.
In countries like Sri Lanka, so disasters don't break the system. So what disasters do is they expose the already broken systems.
Sri Lanka now faces a choice: return to the path of economic growth, or overhaul the country to face the climate crisis and rebuild with resilience. The road ahead is a paradox. Sri Lanka cannot easily afford to do both, but neither can it afford not to.
Well, joining me now to discuss the prospects and choices ahead for Sri Lanka are, from Vancouver, Sri Lankan lawyer Shihar Hassan, from Indianapolis, associate professor of economics at Indiana University, Indianapolis, Vidura Tenekun, and from Oxford, lecturer at the University of Oxford, Tiruni Kelegama. Thank you all so much for being with me. Let's first get a general perspective. And Shihar, I'll start with you. How are you feeling about Sri Lanka right now? Should we be celebrating a comeback or really preparing for something more ominous?
One thing to remember about Sri Lanka is that Sri Lanka has had a history of recovery within 6 to 12 months post crisis. Every crisis, we are a very resilient people. But also, this current crisis is different because the catastrophe that we had after Cyclone Ditwah is post-crisis of the 2022 economic meltdown, and then the cyclone and the transition that happened to elect President Dissanayake. So I would say we have to be optimistic at this point, but the outlook seems positive.
Okay. Let me ask Vidura if you agree. I mean, the cyclone's timing, I think it's not arguable. It almost couldn't have been worse, but still, is Sri Lanka in a strong enough position to bounce back from that as well, given that economists like Joseph Stiglitz have called for, the suspension of external debt repayments because they're so concerned with recovery from just the cyclone?
Yeah, I do think we can say, the Sri Lanka can recover within 1 year, like 6 to 9 months, because of the nature of this type of disasters. Usually the recovery is short term. Of course, the Sri Lanka has been recovering from a bigger economic shock since 2002, and this happened before that recovery was complete. So effectively, what will happen is that bigger recovery will take a little bit longer.
Okay, but do you think economists, leading economist Joseph Stiglitz had said that this needs to be done now, these debt repayments need to be put on hold. Do you think they should be listened to? Are they correct?
I don't think that's necessarily be the case. Based on the preliminary assessments.
I'm curious, why do you think they're concerned and you're not as convinced?
I did not go through his statement or the rationale behind that, but I just went through the detailed report prepared by IMF, preliminary report after the crisis. It has just been published. So going through that, I think the country can recover in its own with the support of the fiscal package and the support from other international organizations.
Let me ask Tiruni, I think we lost your connection for a minute, but hopefully you heard the other panelists' comments. I'd like to get your opinion on the current position of the country, as well as the president's Anura Kumara Dissanayake. How is he holding up in the face of this? He was noted for being a Marxist and for having very left-wing, non-austerity style economic policy, but has he essentially been what the country needs?
Thank you, Andrea. I was kicked off, so I unfortunately didn't hear what was said, but let me answer your question because that's a great one. So when President Dissanayake, he basically entered office with a powerful mandate that was really rooted in, I think, public exhaustion with elite impunity and crisis management, right? His early months really delivered very symbolic and substantive shifts like anti-corruption investigations, prosecutions of previously untouchable figures like the former president, and like a very clear rhetorical break from the political order that presided over the 2022 collapse. And that generated real political goodwill. But what has happened with Ditwah is it has moved that lens from that reformist intent into the governing capacity, right? Natural disasters, what they do is, I think it tests the state operationally and not just ideologically. And what the government has done is it's mobilized emergency services, unauthorized, unprecedented supplementary spending as of like day before yesterday, which has mattered. But there are great concerns which have emerged. So the decision to rely on emergency regulations rather than disaster legislation this raised great questions about institutional learning. There were failures in Tamil language warnings in very heavily affected plantation and rural areas. And this showed that there were communication gaps that transformed vulnerability into an avoidable risk. And then there's also the Rebuilding Sri Lanka Fund, which is substantial in scale, guaranteed, but it has drawn a lot of criticism for a management structure that's dominated by male elites and corporate actors, right? Heightening concerns about elite capture, conflict of interests, and the marginalization of women and local communities. So I think Dissanayaka's challenge is not just political legitimacy, but really administrative credibility, and how and Ditwah really is not a formative moment. It's, yes, let's see what happens.
You know what, we spoke to in our report, one of the experts had said, in countries like Sri Lanka, disasters don't break the system, they expose an already broken system. It sounds like you agree with that. Let me ask Shihar, though, I mean, having said all that, how much then does that leave Sri Lanka going forward at the mercy of climate change, and knowing that Sri Lanka is one of the most vulnerable countries now when it comes to climate disasters?
I would say with the current climate situation around the world, and especially South Asia, becoming more and more vulnerable to the climate disaster that we are seeing around the world, Sri Lanka is susceptible for such climate disasters more often than not. But what I see is that the preparedness that a country like Sri Lanka sees, what I have seen so far around the world is that being poor is expensive when it comes to climate disasters. And what I have seen in Cyclone Ditwah is clearly that. The warning systems were a failure. The hierarchies, the government hierarchies were not working properly. The message was not passed clearly through the system. And there were conflicts in terms of how the disaster and post-disaster has to be managed. So with all this taken into account, what I would say is that it's more important to be prepared for the upcoming disasters than just talking about climate change and disasters in itself.
When we look at kind of the more historic economic trajectory of Sri Lanka, would you say Sri Lanka is simply maintaining the same boom and bust cycle of the past? I mean, it was able to bounce back from bankruptcy, but then another bust could be around the corner. Or do you have more confidence this time?
Not just myself. I would say the entire...
Sorry, Vidura, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yes. I do think, the economy can come back. So based on the projections of IMF has lowered the growth projections for next year from the previous 3.5% to 2.9%. But when it comes to the long-term trajectory, so it was like 3.1%, which remains as is. Their estimate is that there will be a short-term impact, which I do agree, because the effect on economy was mostly on agriculture and tourism, which has a short-term effect, and that effect lasts not more than 6 to 9 months. Of course, there was damage to infrastructure, which can have consequences in the long term, and which needs some funding, and governments has gone for a strong fiscal stimulus, which was supported by some funding from international agencies, including an emergency round from IMF for support to balance the external sector. So with that, I think there's the country has the ability to come back to the original long-term trajectory, to recover, which was the case after the economic crisis in 2022.
Okay. Tiruni,
that's what I say.
I'll ask, are you that optimistic?
That's a good question. Well, in terms of optimism, I think it kind of goes back to what you really asked, right? Because what we have is Sri Lanka stabilization. For me, it does not really represent a decisive break from this boom bust, which I think was your first question. The country has exited formal bankruptcy, restored some measure of macroeconomic order, but in a way, what you have poverty that has more or less doubled. You have an underlying source of fragility, which is really still intact. An external debt service still absorbs like an exceptionally high share of government revenue. So really, I think what has changed is it's really the nature of shocks that Sri Lanka faces. And that basically is where climate disasters are no longer rare, but they are a recurring macroeconomic event that more or less needs to be taken into consideration. So maybe I'm a bit more cautious about saying, maybe just a little bit more cautious about seeing it as recovery, but actually seeing how debt structuring will go on at this point, really.
And Tiruni, when you speak of the nature of those shocks, we have to remember the cyclone came after a massive chemical spill in 2021, whereby Sri Lanka is still, as far as I know, still trying to seek some compensation because the microplastics are still contaminating the fishing industry, some of the beaches. What effect does that collectively have on, the most important industries, including tourism and fishing?
Yes, well, I think, again, it's kind of looking back at Sri Lanka's growth narrative, right? It can be read against, it must be, I think, read against a backdrop of a cumulative series of shocks rather than events. And you just mentioned the chemical spill, which really inflicted lasting damage on coastal ecosystems. And the compensation and remediation is still more or less unresolved, right? And then you have tourism, which has slightly more or less partially recovered and remains a major foreign exchange earner, but it's not really stable still and nor sufficient, and it's neither stable nor sufficient growth anchor. So what you really have is a sector that's really sensitive to environmental degradation, climate events, and even infrastructure disruption. And what happens here is with Ditwah's damage, you really need to see how this will play out. And then you really have the reliance on tourism as a core economic pillar, as you just mentioned. And that carries structure, I think, goes back to the question of recovery and how recovery will work and how reconstruction will actually work and what it'll prioritize under the president.
Okay. Tiruni, I am losing a bit of your audio. I think it's better for our listeners, but I only missed a little bit of what you said. But let me move to Shihar then, because another issue here, it's not just the shocks. There's an inflation worldwide that is really hurting Shihar. It's really hurting consumers. And in Sri Lanka in particular, household debt is considered crippling. So in spite of the overall growth number, it's still hurting consumers. What do you fear as far as household debt is concerned, and what Sri Lankans, in spite of whatever the growth of the economy says, what Sri Lankans themselves can truly afford in order to live, dignified lives that won't lead to more political upheaval?
Yes, I am as much concerned as you are, because what I see is 25% of the Sri Lankan population going to poverty right after the 2022 crisis. But with Cyclone Ditwah on the way, I fear that there's more to come. There's more inflation. There's more people who would fall below the poverty lines. And that means more stress, more tension within the macro and microeconomic sectors. But we should also remember the cyclone affected 2.3 million people of Sri Lanka, which is close to 11% of the Sri Lankan population. And almost 20% of the country's landmass has been affected by the floods. So what I would say, while we are optimistic, the economic growth is not stalled, it's uneven, it's fragile, but more so than the 2022 crisis, now people are going to face the brunt of it far more for recovery than before.
Okay, Vidura, your thoughts again, and also I'm curious as to what you think. We used to hear so much as well about the Chinese debt trap, especially for a country like Sri Lanka. Is that now seen, in your opinion, as kind of beneficial foreign investment that the country can actually use right now and benefit from, or is there still an issue there behind the surface?
There are investments. So the effectiveness of those investments is something to be judged on case-by-case basis. That is something a little bit more complex. But when it comes to, say, investments overall, investments do help overall. Okay, so that's about the investments. So if you want to say something about inflation, which was the discussion, say I can.
Yes, please comment. I had asked earlier about the household debt, which many Sri Lankan citizens will say is absolutely crippling, and that's what's holding the economy back. Yeah.
Right. Of course, because that is where I have some expertise. So I like to talk based on the numbers, actual numbers. So most of the panelists, I mean, both of the panelists highlighted some of the structural issues the country has had, which is true. I agree with that. But they were always there, and those structural issues haven't changed. But if I focus on the effect of Ditwah and what happened after the recent economic crisis, of course, many people were below the poverty line, and the people were in debt. The people who were in debt were increased after the economic crisis, and the inflation was high. But during the recovery, most of these, say, effects reversed to a great extent, and there was a long period of deflation. The prices were dropping. But with Ditwah, at least in the short run, like in the next 6 to 9 months, prices will increase because particularly there will be a shortage of some of the agricultural products produced domestically. And in the short run, inflation will increase. But given we are starting with a very low baseline level, particularly, so it will not be a, say, huge issue. So the inflation will increase to probably to 5 or 6%. Yeah.
Let me ask Tiruni if she's on the same page there, because if it's just a matter of time before it stabilizes, as we were just hearing, do you think the public can hold out for as long as need be, or will we see them again on the verge of some sort of political upheaval because life will just become too expensive for too many people that are already really mired in poverty?
I mean, I think despite the stabilization we have, household economic conditions are deeply strained, right? You have years of inflation, you have wage erosion, subsidy cuts, and they have left many families with really minimal savings and high levels of informal and unsecured debt. So household debt is really a binding constraint on recovery. So, and this is extremely serious, and this is what Ditwah has done. It's compounded these pressures. You have crop losses, you have transport disruptions, supply chain damage, and while reconstruction and basically the supply chain damage will push up food prices, right? While reconstruction also increases food demand. So really the question here is how do you, the challenge is whether not adjustment is really necessary, but then looking at how basically the population that's most exposed to this and how they can move. And this is where this is a real problem. It's the social strain will be incredibly high. There's austerity, there's rising living costs, and household debt will actually be a huge problem. And without targeted relief, then these dynamics risk entrenching poverty and undermining social cohesion as well at this point.
So, Tiruni, quickly, I mean, do you foresee more kind of political upheaval in the years to come, or do you feel the crisis of a few years past and everything that Sri Lanka went through means people won't want to return to what I guess we can consider the bad old days?
You mean as in whether there could be another crisis in the future? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
In a sense.
Because the cost of living, we've heard a number of Sri Lankan households testify to just how expensive life is, even while the country is recording tremendous economic growth. So do you think something might give out, or do you have more confidence than that in the Sri Lankan people who wouldn't want to return to the upheaval we saw in 2021?
Yes, because I think then it's the question of could it cause similar disruptions, right? And I would actually kind of maybe be a bit more cautious about drawing a very direct parallel, because in a way, if you look at the crisis of 2022, there were very different mechanisms. That was driven by a collapse in foreign exchange and paralyzed imports of food, fuel, and medicine. But whereas here, what you have is a domestic production and an infrastructure shock that happened, right? And I think that's a huge distinction that needs to be kind of put on board, but the risks cannot be understated. You have like a large amount of, what you really have is the flooding and landslides have damaged agricultural land, irrigation systems, and then you really, again, going back to the whole debt and the household debt, you have sharp food prices increasing very likely in the coming months, particularly affecting low-income households.
Yeah.
But does that mean whether we'll have a crisis? That's a different kind of thing, because in a way we are looking at reconstruction and watching how reconstruction will play out. There is, and then the question is whether Sri Lanka faces a real risk of inflationary stress and selective scarcities. So
Okay.
avoiding that outcome will basically require a lot of reconstruction and also kind of planning ahead really and that's what we are going to be seeing, how this will play out really.
Okay, Tiruni, that will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time, so I'd like to thank all three of you so much for being with me, our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.